Hey, Comics Cubers. Before we start with today's interview, I want to remind everyone again that we are on Patreon. If you are feeling so generous, please head on over there. The link is down below. There's only one tier. It's $1 a month. It's $1 a month. Please think of it as a tip jar. If you like what the Comics Cube gives you, I would really appreciate it. You're here for J.H. Williams III, and we're talking about the return of Desolation Jones. This time it's the Biohazard edition, which is up for final order cutoff this weekend, the weekend of November 2nd and 3rd. You can go talk to your local comic shop to pre-order it or your local bookstore. So without further ado, let's get down to it. J.H. Williams III, Desolation Jones, the Biohazard edition. Before we go on, I'm sure everybody is asking, when can we expect the return of Echolands?
Yeah, I wish I could answer that. It's ridiculous how much time it's taking. I literally was complaining about how much time it's taking online this week, and I messaged my co-author Hayden Blackman saying, "I'm like, I'm finally up to such and such page." And I'm like, I don't know why this thing is taking me so long. And he messages me back. He goes, "It's taking you so long because it's a passion project." It's I don't know. It's just like, and it was so nice because some other professionals, like there were some fans too, that were like, take as long as it needs. It's, we love what you're doing and stuff. And it's unique. But there were some other people, some professionals that piped in, which was really nice of them, saying, well, you know, you're what you're doing is different. It's like, the layout, the format, everything dictates uh the difficulties. And there's got to be truth in that. Every page is like a learning curve. uh Even though I've been working on this for such a long time now, it astounds me how much stuff still lives in my head in the portrait layout.
Right.
So ideas I'll think of that in the portrait layout would be easier to execute, um, have a whole different level of difficulty being in landscape format. And it fascinates me how much that has an impact still. I'm like, really? I'm 9 issues into this thing and it's still difficult.
Yeah, but
So
you're 30 years into the portrait layout.
that's true. Exactly.
So it's
Yeah.
probably going to take a while.
Yeah. Yeah. But the nice thing is people seem to be patient and are like, whenever, we'll be here when it comes. We're not going anywhere, which is very nice to hear. So I'm almost done with issue 3, or not issue 3, issue 9.
Issue 9.
So, yeah.
Okay. So we will wait. And especially since Echolands is getting like a lot of traction in places like Europe, where everything,
Yeah.
is oversized.
Yeah.
Oh, oh my God, I was in Europe and like all the comics looked so good because everything is so oversized.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so amazing how different the market is there for the format, right?
Right. Everything is really, really pretty, like overlay.
Yes. Yeah.
Uh, Speaking of portrait layouts, let's talk about a work that you did soon after you finished Promethea and before you went on to Batwoman. Um, this work is called Desolation Jones, which we have never really spoken about. And it came out in the mid 2000s. And it is back in the Biohazard edition, which will be out on November 27th. So the Desolation Jones, the Biohazard edition, which you created with Warren Ellis, with Jose Villarubia and Todd Klein.
Yes.
So let's talk about this. How did this project come about? What is it about? And how did the return, the Biohazard edition, come about? in 2024?
So I guess we'll tackle that in the order that
Yeah.
you asked. So after Promethea, or towards the tail end of Promethea, I probably wasn't done with it yet. I was talking to Promethea's then editor, Scott Doombeer, about, hey, I need to start thinking about what I'm going to do next. And I mentioned to him, I'd like to try to do something that's completely a 180 from what Promethea is. Just to do, that creative invigoration by switching gears in such a dramatic way. And he's like, okay, let me think about it. And then he came back to me with this proposal, Desolation Jones proposal. And if I remember correctly, it was only like the original proposal that was sent to me anyway was only like maybe a page and a half long.
Okay.
And I read through, I'm like, oh, this seems super interesting because it has like, kind of spy stuff in it, but then it's crime fiction, noir kind of thing going on. And I was like, yeah, let's do it. This would be a cool thing to do. So that's kind of how it ended up in my hands at that point. What was the second part you asked?
What is Desolation Jones about?
Okay. So it takes place in Los Angeles, where Los Angeles is sort of an open air prison for ex-spies of various different ilk. Some of them having been experimented on to make them more distinct and more adept at what they do. And Desolation Jones is one of those people who now is forced to live in Los Angeles and he cannot leave there. And in order to go about his life, even though he's a character who has a lot of depression and psychological issues stemming from whatever things that were done to him, experiments that were done to him for this Desolation program, he sort of was like, well, I got to go on with things, even though he sort of is down all the time. So he becomes a private detective in Los Angeles. I mean, it's like the classic noir setting, like some of the most classic noirs are in Los Angeles. So it's basically that kind of idea through his lens, that character's lens, about what that life is like and what Los Angeles is like. So it's very much the underbelly of Los Angeles, the seedy parts of that area, and the people he gets mixed up with. And a couple places we meet a couple other people that are like him, that are also trapped in Los Angeles, but they're not necessarily of the same ilk in terms of the Desolation program, but they're ex-spies of various kinds that have roles within the story. But he ends up the crux of the plot is he gets hired by this wealthy guy who is on the verge of death. He's got this family, and for some, I can't remember the specific reasons, but he wants Jones to find Adolf Hitler's lost pornography that he has films that he says there's films of, and they're somewhere in Los Angeles. So he takes on that job because he's like, I need the money, and it turns into this convoluted thing, and the family he's dealing with are messed up people. It becomes really, really convoluted and crazy. But what makes Desolation Jones so compelling is the things that were done to him, which are never fully answered in the story, but that's what sort of is some of the magic about the story. There's things that are left a mystery.
Mm-hmm.
But the experiments aged him beyond his actual years. So he looks really messed up. But he also hallucinates from these experiments. So his perspective of reality sometimes is fascinating. And he never really doesn't ever really seem to let the hallucinations affect his actions, but they sort of make him see the meaning of reality in a kind of different way. He doesn't voice it much, but he's noting like, oh, yeah, all the souls of Los Angeles are rising up out of the city as angels. And he takes note of that. And it's sort of like paints a little bit of color on his worldview, I guess.
Right.
And it's almost like the hallucinations are sort of a subconscious thing about who he is and where he is, which is fascinating.
To say that Desolation Jones is was a very big departure from something like Promethea, I think is a little bit of an understatement. Um,
Yes.
but where I don't think it departs that much is because, as I mentioned to you before, if you look at your work from Promethea 1 to Promethea 32, you can really see the additional techniques and evolution that you have as an artist.
Yeah.
And at this point in Desolation Jones, I kind of feel like it was a natural the way that you laid out the pages was a natural transition from the kind of
Yeah.
things you were doing at the end of Promethea, where you were highlighting certain aspects with color,
Yeah.
and it's all double page spreads, etc. Can you talk about where you were in your artistic journey when Desolation Jones was coming out?
So the way Jones was written, okay, like Promethea, for those that are familiar or might not be familiar, almost all of Promethea had a lot of double page spreads, where Jones has much less of that. So there was a lot of places, and I think there's some instances, some of the double page spreads I ended up doing in Jones were just me making them that way.
You weren't in the
But
script?
right.
Okay.
And so it was me kind of trying to bring some of that pacing sensibility I was interested in into into something like Jones. But then at the same time, some of the layouts, oddly, I was kind of interested in like, can we give this sort of like a newspaper strip feel with some of the double page spreads? So it kind of had that feeling, which also informed Todd's decision on how to do the lettering balloon
Mhm.
style. Has an older flavor like that too, which is super cool. But then also I wanted to figure out ways, even though it's a crime noir, to have lots of color. Uh, the and you're treating the hallucination stuff in a different technique than the other stuff. It was interesting. Also, creatively, I was trying to find something different about Jones, the way I would draw characters. So in the new edition, there's a gallery section. And the first page in there, as I was looking for stuff I had to put into the gallery, I came across the very first drawing I ever did of Desolation Jones. And it's interesting because when I first was trying to tackle it, I kind of viewed like, oh, maybe I should try something that's a little bit more on the cartoony side, but still gritty with textures. That ended up not being successful for me. And I ended up doing something a little bit more realistic in with the actual art, but it still kept that gritty, rough inking style in there. So I'd say that's another kind of different thing compared to Promethea is the inking techniques I used in Jones has a much more gritty urban kind of thing going on
Well,
compared to Promethea.
yeah, not to mention this is also the first time you're not being inked by Mick Gray.
Yeah, yeah. So at that time, creatively, there was parts of Promethea towards the tail end where I was doing all the stuff, um, doing some traditional inks on Promethea here and there, not credited stuff that I just like I want to try. And
Mhm.
also at that time, I was doing covers for Marvel where I was inking my own stuff as well, towards the tail end of Promethea. And it was sort of like feeling like in order to grow, and push myself into new boundaries, new territories, I mean, I had to start inking my own stuff. There was no way around it. Um, it quickly was becoming one of those things, like for me to capture a certain effect, there was just no way I could pencil that and expect it to translate in the way I kind of want to see it.
Yeah.
And so I started to grow as an artist, uh, and try different things. I started inking my own work. And one of the people that kind of pushed me into that is, interestingly, was Arthur Adams.
Really?
Yeah. Um, and Wendy as well. My wife Wendy was pushing me to broaden my horizons as well. And both of them were kind of saying, well, like it might have been a joint conversation she had with Arthur. I can't remember specifically, but I remember conversations about all the artists I admire ink
Mhm.
their own work.
Okay.
And so I'm like, okay. And so, from Arthur's point of view, because he ended up inking his own work very shortly in a short amount of time, he's like, yeah, you got to do it. you know, and Wendy was like, you got to do it. Like all the people you admire all ink their own stuff. And so it's like to find a more pure version of myself. That's what I had to do. Um, so that's pretty interesting change for me. And I remember how I still have a little bit of this in me because I had worked with inkers for so long. Um, so I still have trepidation about doing inks, especially because my tremor gets involved. But I remember when I was, because Jones being the first thing where I'm like, no, I'm going to do it all. Uh, how trepidatious I was. I was so felt out of my element doing it. But then, years later, thinking back about that, I remember in recent times seeing, this great recorded quote from David Bowie saying, "Yeah, no, if you're not feeling," he's like, if you're not uncomfortable, you're not in the right place. You have to be uncomfortable. That's
Yeah.
how you know you're where you're supposed to be."
It's like what's the
So
what's the point otherwise?
yes,
Uh
so
y-
that's kind of interesting, the trajectory I was taking there and trying to see what I was capable of. And looking back on the pages, because I had to go through the book all over again for this new edition, for the years. It's been years since I looked at that stuff, and there's some stuff I look at, I'm like, actually that's not too bad. And there's other parts where I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's bad. you know
would you redo them if they'd given you the opportunity?
that would be tempting, but no. I think
Okay.
because it kind of has to be of what it is. The only things I retouched in the book are things that were actual mistakes that had to be
Okay.
corrected. That never got the opportunity to be corrected. So since I had the pages in hand and we were going to do a new edition and I had all the original stuff to work with, I'm like, no, I'm going to correct that. That's not supposed to be like that. I remember that's not supposed to be like that. I'm going to correct that. So that kind of stuff.
You mentioned before that working on Promethea was a very, very personal experience for you, and Promethea ended on such a hopeful, positive note that I imagine that working on Desolation Jones had a bit of emotional whiplash.
Yeah, it was so different, but that's sort of what I was asking for, is for it to be so different. Um, and it was a cool learning experience to see what it would bring out in me, being so different than Promethea, right? Um, and I think that's why when I look at the material now, going for the new book, I can kind of look at it and go, and like, yeah, no, I'm proud of what we did here. It's actually holds up, surprisingly better than I remember. Uh, so that's exciting for me. Yeah.
Yeah. It is also notably one of the J.H. Williams III works where the protagonist is not a female in a red cape.
Yeah. Yeah. Nothing about Jones is attractive. He,
Uh,
he messed up. He's as messed up looking as he is on the inside.
I do think that a lot of it has a lot to do with the writer Warren Ellis, because I do think that tonally speaking, Desolation Jones shares a lot in common with people like Spider Jerusalem from
Yeah,
from Transmetropolitan, um,
yeah,
and a lot of Warren's other protect, like the way he treats John Constantine. Uh, so can you
yeah.
talk about the collaboration process and what you like, what was in the script, but you added in? Because you mentioned that the proposal came to you, that meaning that it existed, the proposal existed without an artist in mind, I'm assuming.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. And so they were looking for somebody for it. I imagine at that time, Warren probably had numerous proposals in editors' hands. I would not be surprised if there's material out there that he had proposals for that have never seen the live day. Uh, he's prolific in that way, coming up with a lot of different ideas. Um, so the thing that was interesting to get used to when working on Jones was like when I compared to Promethea or say Seven Soldiers of Victory, which was also around that similar
Around
time
that time, yeah.
period, was the access I had to who I was working with. So, I could call up Alan, I could get a hold of Grant, and we could talk about things through, talk things through. Warren wasn't as easily accessible for whatever reason. I have no answers to that. So early on in the first issue or so of working on the material, I really felt like I was swimming in the deep end because I didn't have that same creative rapport that I was used to. And I had to be completely reliant on my own perspective of what is in the scripts
And you're inking your own stuff.
and inking my own stuff. Yeah. So it was a very uh uneasy time creatively in that regard. And so after the first issue, probably around after the first issue, I kind of had to like, okay, I need to set aside my expectations of what I'm looking for out of the creative collaboration partnership and just do what I want to do with what Warren has given me the way I see it. And that was kind of cool because there was a little bit of sense of freedom in that way.
Mhm.
Um, and just being able to try to interpret what Warren is saying between the lines of the scripts. And the other difference also is his scripting style versus say like Grant's scripting style, so chaotic in a lot of ways, or at least it was back then. Um, and Alan's stuff was so like very completely thorough. And Warren had this back then I was unsure about it because it was so different from what I was used to. But in retrospect, I can appreciate the judicious aspects of his writing, the simplicity of the way he presents it, um, is kind of nice. There's just sort of like um, it's not trying to be overly uh, overbearing in any way at all. And that was interesting. And that was probably also led to me feeling like I'm swimming in the deep end as well, right? Um, so it was, yeah, I'm not sure what else I could say about it other than that feeling of trying to find myself.
So when were you comfortable enough to go off script on things like changing something into a double page spread or
Probably at the end of issue one,
okay.
where it was kind of like, hey, I'm a smart enough individual. I can figure out how to do this. I did it on Promethea where there's things I turned into spreads or handled a spread differently than the way Alan suggested, and had to find my own sense of confidence working on it, even though I'm working with people I've never worked with before.
You know, you're the
Um,
only one who ever says that to me. Like everybody
oh,
else says they don't deviate much from Alan scripts. You're the only one who ever says,
I trusted Alan when he would tell me, like, if you see it differently, Jim,
yeah.
go for it. Like, I even remember calling him, like, hey, I see this going this way. And he's like, if that's the way you see it, Jim, then do it. He
Everybody
completely trusted me. So
ev- everybody else is like, well, he says we can change it, but like what is there to change?
I think it's more like it wasn't like necessarily kind of like reconstructing everything he wrote. It was more like taking everything he wrote and constructing it in a way that the writing didn't necessarily anticipate.
Uh-huh.
Makes sense, right? So not changing story details, it's more in the way the information's presented, if that makes sense.
Do you think
Yeah.
being able to do that uh with the writing of somebody like Alan Moore's gave you more confidence to do that with succeeding writers?
Yes, but not at first. That's the weird part, right? You would think that would have like really like, oh yeah, I can just plow through and know exactly what to do. But it's yeah. I'd say Jones gave me more confidence because by the time I was in the deep into that, it was very I kind of had to make it my own
Right.
in a way. Um,
Oh, because with Alan stuff, you could clear it with Alan, and with this stuff,
yeah,
with Jones, you're just like, well, I'm gonna
yeah,
do it now.
yeah. Um, and it was tough at the time, but like I said, in retrospect, it was probably a good learning tool for me. Uh, I want to go back to something you mentioned about Jones's character compared to other Warren Ellis characters, how there's such a similarity to them. In my experience of reading Warren's other stuff, he's always been a tremendous author. But one of the things that I found with Jones as a character, and I talk about this because I write an introduction to the book,
Mhm.
and I mentioned this briefly in there about as messed up as everything is, as messed up of what's happened to Jones and what's messed up about the things he does. There's something extremely uh human in Desolation Jones, the story by the even though he knows he comes across as a character who is deeply affected by what happens to those around him
Right.
because of him. It's not like you can see it, you can feel it in the character. And I think that's what's so great about the story. Regardless of all the weird stuff that's in it, um, at the end of the day, it feels like a very human story and a story that's full of heart. More comes through more in this than I think in some of Ellis's other works.
I agree with that.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend who really loved Warren's work, and he calls the standard Warren Ellis character the hyper competent a-hole.
That's funny.
The hyper competent cynical a-hole, right? But I do think that there are differences to that. Like I don't think Planetary really has it.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think that, like, in comparison to Spider Jerusalem, the thing with Jones is that there are moments, like especially when he's hallucinating, he's
Yeah.
hallucinating the angels and stuff, where like you can kind of really see the humanity. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, life sucks, but at least there's angels in the sky.
Yeah. Or the way he uh gives in to showing um compassion and sympathy to the other ex-spy that
Yeah.
has the like pheromone type powers or something like that. How isolated she has to be. That scene with her when she's asking him to stay because she was so lonely, the way that is crafted, the way Warren put that in there was so it really gets you, you know.
Yeah, and you executed it so quietly too.
Oh,
So
thanks.
that character is Emily,
Yeah.
who cannot, like, because of her power, everybody just cannot handle being around her.
Yes. Yeah. It literally can make someone ill.
Right.
You know. Yeah. And the way, the way Jones recognizes that human need she has to quell her loneliness in some way shows just how human Jones actually is. So he's almost like this character. He doesn't want to be as human as he is, but he is.
He can't help it.
He fights against that in some ways.
You drew the first 6 issues that was entitled Made in England. You notably did not draw the second story arc, which only lasted like a couple more
Two,
issues after that.
two, yeah.
Um, may I ask what happened? And if you don't want to tell me what happened, it's okay.
We'll just cover it briefly. So at the time, uh, this is well known. Warren had difficulties not just with my project, but scripts being not on time and things like that. And Jones was kind of suffering from some of that taking place. So that in terms of like a working, like, I know the way Wendy describes the way I treat my comics work is very blue collar, kind of workmanlike. Um, that I have a diligence about making sure I'm working all the time. Scripts are late for whatever reason. That can make, that makes it difficult in terms of when you're used to working all the time and uh, people relying on you for an income, you know, bringing money into the house and stuff like that. That makes it really hard. Um, and so I was feeling like that was increasingly becoming difficult for us to navigate, and and still being kind of uncomfortable with the lack of being able to communicate. Um, Kind of put me in a position to where I'm like, I just felt like I had that wasn't going to change, and
Mhm.
so I felt like I had to step out at that point at the end of it. Issue 6, I had just, and I decided, I think I probably decided at the somewhere around issue 5 that issue 6 that would be it. Um, because it just was difficult. It's just the reality of the situation. Um, uh, I don't know what happened, why the second arc with the other artist that ended up not only having 2 issues. I don't know, maybe that some of those logistical problems were continuing. I don't know.
So
Maybe.
the other artist is named Daniel Zizelge, and is um, not exactly on your caliber. I'll just say, in terms of, yeah, at least name recognition,
Oh, I see.
and so I think that you leaving the book definitely had an effect. Maybe like pre-orders went down or something.
Yeah, I have no idea.
Because I definitely stopped buying it.
Yeah, I have no idea what happened after, what the audience response was after. Um, but I had to do what was best for, our living situation and career situation at that point, and move on and let them have someone else come in. And that was around the time, Seven Soldiers of Victory was going on. Um, and DC coming to me and saying, if you want Batman, it's yours. Um, and I knew that would be stable, you know. Um, and so that's I had to make a tough decision. No one was happy about it, I'll tell you that. Uh, and I completely understand why no one was happy about that, but it was I was kind of felt like I didn't have a choice at that point. Um, uh, but now, with in terms of like the new edition, what's interesting is the new edition, Warren and I have talked since then and have come to a lot of understanding and stuff, um, uh, which is good, I think. And when we talked about doing this new edition, because DC had it in their clutches for a long time, but they weren't going to. They seemed like they weren't interested in doing new printings of it. And then I randomly get a letter from, I think it might have been from DC's lawyers, saying, we're, according to the contract, we're not going, we're cutting the contract free. Here's a little thing that was in the contract, a small amount of money that we're ending our publishing deal. So there's a little bit of money, and all the rights are returned to you and Warren. And that's when I was like, oh, this is interesting.
It is.
And
yeah, it is interesting.
Yeah, I'm not sure why. I'd heard from some other people who had other projects at DC that were also getting similar sort of things, where DC was like, yeah, we're going to cut this loose because we don't think we'll reprint it. And for whatever reason, they're just relinquishing their attachment to it. So at that point, I was like, this is interesting. Now what do we do? And I was a little bit frustrated with the whole thing before that, because there was no new editions of Jones. So it just felt like this project that I enjoyed doing for various reasons was in this limbo. And because it was in this limbo, it became kind of a lesser known thing that I've done. But then when we got the rights back, I'm like, oh, well, maybe something can actually happen with this now. We can do a new edition. And that's how somewhere along the way, Image got involved in that. I can't remember in what order of events, how that took place, but Eric Stevenson was like, he's like, no, Jones deserves to be in print. It should be in print. He's like, I don't know why it's not in print, and he's like, we need to rectify that. And so that what led to conversations about doing a new edition. But we decided, because there was never any more stories done, that second arc never got remotely close to being completed. I talked to Warren a little bit about that and said, perhaps we should consider, if we're going to put out a new edition, we should consider those first 6 issues the complete work. And it functions beautifully on its own, even though there's unanswered questions, but that's sort of the beauty of the story. I'm of the mind that not all things have to be answered. Right. That can actually, it keeps you wondering about stuff. And that I feel like the story functions really beautifully, even though you don't know all the gory details of what happened to Jones to make him like he is. You have enough clues there for you to fill in some of your own ideas. That's what's so cool about it. And so I said, if we're going to do a new edition, let's treat it as a singular complete work, stuff like that. Even with the remastered art, we took out the title that says Made in England. It just says chapter, where it said Made in England Part 1 or whatever. Now it just says Chapter 1. So I created new titles for that to solidify the idea of it being a singular book. It's a novel.
It's its own graphic novel.
Yes.
Yeah, because it would be weird if you included the two other issues.
Yes, I think so too. And it wasn't a decision to denigrate or dismiss the other issues by Daniel at all. It just made more publishing sense to me to have it be so singular.
Yeah, as a reader,
Warren thought that was a great idea. He was like, yeah, he's like, there's not going to be any more Jones, so we'll make this the focal point,
As a reader, if you had included the other 2 issues, it would drive me nuts. like these two other issues drawn by a completely different artist and it doesn't even have an ending, that would drive me insane. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It just in order to kind of make it a novel, like its own graphic novel, it just seemed like the smarter thing to do. Um, and then that way we could market it as what it is. Yeah.
um, it is a deluxe hardcover called the Biohazard edition, and it will have bonus material showcasing a bunch of your pages in its raw form, which I feel like this is just standard for you now with collected editions.
I kind of feel like it's nice if you have the pages, you know, put something in them, put something there. Uh, and so, yeah, and it also allows it to be different than the previous trade paperback of it too. So it's not just a repeat of the materials that were in the trade paperback, which is always nice too. So basically, we tried to look for any way to make it distinct from the previous old DC version, um, giving it a new cover, a new back cover, front and back cover design work by me. I did all new design work for the interior of the book, the gallery section. Uh, they were great and let me write an introduction to it, and stuff like that, which is kind of cool because then I can kind of like look at and go, um, feel like I have more investment in what it is, compared to how it was uh, at the prior publisher.
Yeah, I think I was surprised because I was looking at it before this interview and I was like, wait, didn't DC publish this? So that's why,
Yeah.
like, I'm glad you answered that question. What is it like looking at it now and having worked with Dave Stewart for so long at this point and seeing Jose's colors again?
Yeah, it's interesting because like there's a lot of Jose's approach is so different than Dave's, but yeah, both of them are tremendous. Uh, uh, what was fascinating looking at Jones with Jose's color treatments is how effective he is at making it feel acidic, which is what it needed to be. Even though it's a noir, it's extremely colorful, but everything about Jones's life is it's just visceral and acidic. It's hard. It should be hard uh, to take in and visually look at. And that also leads to some of the content, the way we treated some of the visual content, the violence as an example.
Mhm.
Then this goes back when I read reviews that I don't do anymore. I remember reading a review of Jones when it was coming out, and someone was saying, I don't remember which issue it was, but it was one of the issues where the violence really ramped up, and someone was saying, like, I don't know about this Desolation Jones book. The violence is so disturbing. And I'm like, that's the point.
That is the point.
Yeah. If you're not disturbed by it, then what is wrong? I wanted it to feel visceral. Um, so I tried to do things to make it a gut punch, that violence, through various visual tricks. Uh, but then also that kind of, it's a bit of a digression. But it also leads me because you were talking about some of the visual approach to Jones,
Yeah.
and that was always interesting conversations with Jose, is trying to convey when when to experiment with the color as well as what the art is doing. So things like uh, the moments in Jones where all of a sudden everything will go black and white, and it becomes like this harsh graphic hit in the face when it does that. But then at the time, I also remembering doing things like thinking about crime fiction films, particularly modern day crime fiction films, and how they feel when they are violent. and like, well, how do I capture this? How do you make something slow motion in a comic book, right? Even though
Hmm.
it's an action scene, because slow motion stuff in cinema, action movies, like, yeah, you see that all the time, right? And so it made me think of things like, well, we could go black and white and do two things to the reader at the same time. Black and white, drop the backgrounds, but then the figures in the shot might, instead of having hard black line rendering, all of a sudden it's all crosshatch stuff. So you're forced to stop. So there was a lot of experimentation with that, and conveying that, trying to get that conveyed with the color was interesting because it was a very different approach than some of the things in Promethea.
Right.
Um, yeah,
I think this is the
and to
first
see if it
time
can
I've
work.
seen you do the drop backgrounds. You're referring to
Yeah,
whenever when the color and the background doesn't actually don't actually match.
yeah,
Right. I think that's the first time. I think this was the first time I saw you doing that.
yeah. Or isolating the movement in a panel by creating an inset panel, even though, say, like a bullet's coming across in the trajectory, and then boom, there's a isolation of just the bullet,
Hmm.
you know,
Exactly.
it's still set in the scene, but then somehow that's separated in ways to do that, not just with the frame, but with the color. And Jose uh, was understanding a lot of what I was asking for. Um, and in some ways, because I was trying to push myself into doing some things I did not do in Promethea, in some ways, most likely I was overbearing about what I was asking for in terms of like, no, it has to be this way, you know, um, which probably wasn't necessarily fair to him because he's going to have his own ideas on how to maybe tackle that scene. But, I was so married to what it's doing visually, I already have the thing in my head of what it should be. And so trying to convey that to somebody and not drive them crazy, you know.
But it looks great. Desolation Jones is back in print. We are all very happy about that. It will be out in December of this year, and
Yeah.
the FOC for it will be now. Whenever I put this up now,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
And
congratulations on reprinting Desolation Jones, and it's going to be in the big hardcover Biohazard edition.
yeah, deluxe sized hardcover. Should look really nice. It'll be the same size as the Dracula book. So
Dang,
yeah,
that's going to look great. That's going to
I
look
hope
great.
so. And Jose's colors should look fantastic on that. The paper stock is the same paper stock that we use on Echolands. So everything about it should look really sharp. Jose's colors should really pop. Um, and that was the other thing that was interesting about the colors that he would do, capturing the hallucinatory acidic bits, but then be able to juxtapose that with scenes where it's muted color. Like as an example, the scene when he's interviewing that person that works in the porn industry
Mhm.
the bar, how Jose was so smart about having all that conversation stuff have this muted quality, but then when Jones starts to have his hallucinations and starts seeing things in a different way, how Jose was able to pick up on those cues and sell that moment. Like at one moment she kind of becomes like a cartoon, and he's like, does some interesting things with the color there too. It's cool.
Jose obviously is one of the greatest colorists in the history of the business.
Yeah. His
And
his his current work on the Richard Corbin reprints has been interesting. How
yeah,
he's bringing that out. Yeah.
and he's also I know you're not on Facebook, but he also has a series of posts up on Facebook where he critiques color and recoloring. It's all
Uh,
very interesting.
cool. And it's such a fascinating thing, having been worked with a variety of colorists now, how each of them have their own approach. And in my view, I kind of feel like none of them are necessarily wrong approaches, even though they're so different. And that's what's kind of like, I guess you could equate that to how much colorists have an effect on the final product, just like the artist chosen has an effect on the final product, right? And it's great to see such a diversity of colorists out there in terms of their techniques and styles, just like there is for the person doing the drawings.
Yes.
So like going from, like Lilo Ridge, who I worked with early on, to Jeremy Cox, to Jose, to uh to Dave, and they all have their own particular idiosyncrasies that make them them. Um, I the only time I ever am critical of a colorist is when they color stuff the same no matter who's drawing it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you
And
mean.
so I really appreciate colorists that are willing to have those conversations about what can be done, what can be tried. And like I said before, I probably have driven people nuts in the past because I'm so particular about what I'm looking for. But at the same time, it's like I feel like it, I can't do what I do if I'm not thinking about that ahead of time
It's
in terms
true
of,
though.
you
Like
know, so
color can have like a really big effect on a story.
yeah,
I'll use a very famous example, which is the John Higgins colors of The Killing Joke and Brian Bolland's colors of The Killing Joke.
yes,
Those are two completely different things.
yes, dramatically so.
Like, the effect that it has on you viscerally is just not the same at all.
Yeah, yeah. Or even like when you look at the recolors of Alan's Swamp Thing,
Different.
the
Yeah.
absolute versus the original colors is so whoa, dramatically different. Yeah.
And Jose tends on his Facebook, Jose tends to go to town on people recoloring the really old comics.
Oh,
You know,
is
and
he a fan of it?
well, frankly, a lot of them is not great.
Oh,
Like we're talking like Kirby comics, right? Like it's just like why would you do 3D on a Kirby
oh
comic?
yes, I see what you mean.
I
Uh-huh.
don't. So yeah, but congratulations on Desolation Jones. We're looking forward to Desolation Jones, and we're also looking forward to the return of Echo Lands.
I have a page sitting right there as proof. It's getting done. On the two social media accounts I have, I posted a page in progress, and it's the one that's on there. It's almost done.
Desolation Jones, the Biohazard edition, is now out for FOC when this video is up. And go to your local comic shop and place an order. Thank you so much.
And,
Until next time.